My parents said I was allergic to everything. I discovered they were slowly poisoning me to keep me dependent. I spent 17 years believing I was allergic to 43 different substances: foods, medications, environmental triggers, even sunlight. My mother Diane controlled every aspect of my existence because leaving the house could kill me. She was a former nurse who dedicated her life to keeping me alive. I was homeschooled, isolated, and took 15 pills every morning from bottles she kept locked in her bathroom. My medical alert bracelet listed allergies that made normal life impossible. I'd never eaten in a restaurant, never had friends, never done anything without her careful management. My father left when I was 3 because I was too much work, too expensive, too sick. That's what she told me anyway. She showed me divorce papers where he'd signed away his rights. I felt guilty every day for being the burden that destroyed our family, for being the reason she had no life outside managing my illness. She saw different doctors in different cities every few weeks, always seeking fresh perspectives on my complex case. Every specialist added medications or restrictions. My identity was built entirely around being sick. When I turned 17, my mother announced we were moving to Oregon for a specialized clinic treating patients like me. She started packing frantically, throwing things away, saying we'd start fresh. I was sorting through her closet looking for boxes when I found a locked metal container hidden under old sweaters. I pried it open with a screwdriver. Inside were psychiatric records with her name, not mine. Diagnoses for Munchausen syndrome by proxy from 15 years ago. Court documents showing my father had won full custody of me because of her mental health issues. A restraining order barring her from unsupervised contact. Police reports about a kidnapping during a supervised visit. Newspaper articles about my father desperately searching for his stolen son, begging for information, never giving up. The most recent article was from 6 months ago. He'd been looking for me my entire life. She'd let me believe he abandoned me when he'd actually fought for me and lost me to her crimes. But the worst thing I found was her notebook. Pages of logs documenting what she'd given me on which days and in what amounts. Substances mixed into my food to cause vomiting, hives, respiratory distress, antihistamines withheld to make reactions worse. She'd been poisoning me deliberately for 17 years and documenting it like a science experiment. She walked in and found me sitting there with her documents spread around me. Her face went white, then cold and calculating. She sat on her bed and said she did it because she loved me too much to let me go, that keeping me sick was the only way to keep me close, to make sure I'd never leave her. I asked if I was actually allergic to anything, and she said no, nothing. Every reaction I'd ever had was something she caused with carefully measured doses. She'd made me afraid of food and life and my own body. I stood up to call the police, and she grabbed my arm, begging me not to destroy both our lives. She promised she'd stop. We could start over in Oregon. Things would be different. She cried and said she'd sacrificed everything for me. I pulled away and locked myself in my room. My hands shook, and I couldn't breathe from real panic. I had no phone, no way to contact anyone without her hearing. My laptop had parental controls monitoring everything. I was trapped in a cage I'd just discovered was intentional. I waited until after midnight when she was asleep, then climbed out my window for the first time in my life. I went to our neighbor's house and used his landline to call information. I got my father's number from the court documents, Raymond Gallagher in Denver. It was 1 a.m, but he answered. I told him I thought I might be his son Owen. He started crying immediately and said he'd been searching for 15 years, never stopped looking, always believed I was alive. He asked where I was and said to stay there. He was calling the FBI right now. Said he loved me and missed me every day, and soon this would be over. I waited in the neighbor's kitchen until morning. The FBI arrived at 7 with a warrant. They brought my mother out in handcuffs while she screamed that I was sick and needed her. An agent named Carol Pruitt explained what happened next. They'd found my mother's notebook and her supply of poisons. I'd be taken to a hospital for evaluation, and my father was already on a plane. She said what my mother did was Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a serious crime, that I wasn't at fault and was safe now. At the hospital, doctors ran comprehensive tests. A pediatric specialist said I wasn't allergic to anything. My blood work was normal, immune system fine, no medical reason I couldn't live normally. I started crying from anger at what was stolen from me. 17 years of fear based on lies. She said that anger was healthy. My father arrived that afternoon. I didn't remember him, but I looked exactly like him. He cried when he saw me and asked if he could hug me. He held me like I might disappear and kept apologizing. Said he should have found me sooner. I told him it wasn't his fault. The FBI found everything in our house. My mother's hidden pharmacy in the basement with bottles of Ipecac, irritants, expired medications, her detailed logs documenting what she'd given me and my reactions, fake medical records she'd created. They found evidence she was planning to run again. The Oregon clinic didn't exist. Agent Pruitt said they were charging her with kidnapping, child abuse, medical fraud. They needed my testimony and wanted me to wear a wire to get her confession on tape. My father didn't want me to, but I said yes. I wanted her to admit it where I could hear it. They set up a monitored phone call. My mother answered, sounding scared and small. I told her I'd read her notebook, every page. She didn't deny it. She explained that after my father left, she couldn't lose me, so keeping me sick meant I needed her. She described the substances she'd used, how she'd measured doses to cause symptoms without permanent damage, how she'd doctor shopped and moved cities to avoid suspicion. She said it started small, making me throw up so my father would see I needed her, then escalated after the divorce when he tried to take me. I asked if she understood what she'd done, and she said she'd sacrificed everything for me, and I betrayed her by going to the FBI. The recording captured her confession, her justifications, her complete lack of remorse. Agent Pruitt said it gave them everything they needed. My father asked if I wanted to talk about it, and I said no. I just wanted it over. The house search found a storage unit with documents from every city we'd lived, every fake name she'd used, photographs of me looking sick at different ages, letters she'd written to me describing me like a possession. The prosecutor said my mother's nursing background worked against her because she'd known exactly what she was doing medically. Her documentation made it the most thoroughly documented abuse case they'd ever seen. She said these crimes happened more often than people realized, but were hard to prosecute. This case could set precedent. My father enrolled me in therapy with Dr. Helena Vaughn, who specialized in medical trauma. She asked what foods I wanted to try now that I knew I wasn't allergic, what activities I'd missed, what healthy felt like. I told her I still felt sick sometimes, felt reactions starting even though doctors said I was fine. She said 17 years of conditioning had taught my brain to interpret signals as dangerous. We'd retrain those neural pathways slowly. She gave me homework like eating one new food weekly, going outside in the sun longer each day, noticing when I avoided things from real caution versus conditioned fear. The work was harder than expected. My body didn't know how to exist without constant monitoring. The trial was scheduled 6 months later. My mother's attorney tried negotiating a plea, but the prosecutor refused. She wanted this case to go to trial to set precedent. I'd have to testify, and I was terrified, but Dr. Vaughn helped me prepare. My father had remarried a woman named Simone, who was kind and careful with me. She made dinner every night and asked what I wanted without checking if it was safe first, because everything was safe now. That took weeks to get used to. My father had kept my childhood bedroom exactly as it was, all my toddler toys and books like he always knew I'd come home. Walking in felt like stepping into a museum of someone else's life. I found photos of myself as a baby, healthy and normal before my mother started poisoning me. Simone had a daughter from her previous marriage named Isabel, who was away at college studying psychology. She came home for winter break and we met awkwardly in the kitchen. She'd heard about what happened and didn't treat me like I was fragile. She asked what I wanted to do now that I could do anything, and I realized I didn't know. I'd spent so long thinking about what I couldn't do that I'd never imagined what I wanted. She suggested small things, going to a movie theater, trying different restaurants, walking around the mall without purpose, normal teenage activities I'd missed. We started hanging out and she became the first real friend I'd ever had. She didn't ask about my mother or the abuse unless I brought it up. She just treated me like a regular person figuring out life. When she went back to college, she texted me daily with random things, memes and songs and questions about what I was eating. It sounds small, but it meant everything. Having someone check in who wasn't monitoring me for symptoms but just cared about my day. My father noticed I was smiling more and said Simone had been right that having someone my age around would help. I started sleeping better, having fewer nightmares about being trapped in that house taking pills from my mother's hands. The trial started on a cold Monday in January. The courthouse was downtown and we had to go through security. My father held my hand like I was still a little kid, and I let him. The courtroom was smaller than I expected with wood paneling and uncomfortable benches. My mother sat at the defense table looking thin and tired. She turned when I walked in and tried to catch my eye, but I looked away. The prosecutor was a woman named Ava Chen, who'd explained to me that this case mattered beyond just my situation. That Munchausen syndrome by proxy happened more often than people knew, and prosecutions were rare because they were hard to prove. My mother's documentation made this different. Her own records would convict her. The prosecutor's opening statement laid out the case methodically. Kidnapping during a supervised visit. 15 years on the run using fake identities. Systematic poisoning of a child to maintain control. Medical fraud through doctor shopping and fake records. The jury looked shocked when she described the substances my mother had used and their effects. The defense attorney's opening was shorter, arguing that my mother was mentally ill and needed treatment, not prison, that she genuinely believed she was protecting me from a world she perceived as dangerous. The prosecution spent 3 days presenting evidence. FBI agents testified about finding me and searching our house. They showed photos of my mother's hidden pharmacy, bottles of poisons and irritants lined up like a laboratory. They showed her logs documenting doses and reactions spanning years. Medical experts explained each substance and what it would do to a child's body, how ipecac caused vomiting, how certain irritants caused hives and respiratory distress, how withholding antihistamines made reactions worse. A forensic psychologist testified about Munchausen syndrome by proxy, explaining it as a mental disorder where a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in someone under their care to gain attention and sympathy. She said it often involved medical professionals who had the knowledge to create symptoms without getting caught, that it was fundamentally about control and the gratification the abuser received from being seen as a devoted caregiver. The psychologist said my mother's case was textbook but extreme because of the duration and documentation. Most cases were caught within a few years. 15 years was extraordinarily rare. My father testified on the fourth day. He explained fighting for custody when I was 2, because he'd noticed inconsistencies in my medical issues. How I'd be perfectly fine during his visits but supposedly deathly ill, according to my mother. How he'd won custody after psychiatric evaluations showed my mother had Munchausen syndrome by proxy. How he'd agreed to supervised visits thinking I'd be safe with monitors present. How my mother had taken me during a visit to the park and disappeared. How he'd reported it immediately, and the FBI had opened a kidnapping case. How he'd spent 15 years searching, hiring private investigators, following leads that went nowhere, never believing I was dead, even when people told him to move on. He cried on the stand, describing the phone call at 1 a.m. when I'd called him. How he'd thought it was a cruel prank until he heard my voice and knew immediately it was real. The defense attorney asked if he'd ever considered that maybe my allergies had been real and my mother was genuinely trying to help me. My father looked at her and said no, because the medical tests after I was found proved I had no allergies. Because my mother's own notebook admitted she'd poisoned me. Because 17 years of my life had been stolen and he'd watched me grow up in photographs taken by someone who was torturing me. The courtroom went quiet. Then it was my turn to testify. Dr. Vaughn had prepared me, but walking to the witness stand felt like walking toward a cliff edge. I was sworn in, and the prosecutor asked me to state my name. I said Owen Gallagher, and my voice shook. She asked me to describe my childhood, and I told them about the isolation, the fear, the constant medical appointments, about taking pills every morning and night that I now knew were making me sick instead of helping me, about the medical alert bracelet I'd worn listing 43 allergies that didn't exist, about never going to school or making friends or doing normal activities because my mother said the world was too dangerous for someone like me. The prosecutor asked if I remembered being taken from my father, and I said no, I was too young. She asked what my mother had told me about him, and I explained the lies, that he'd abandoned me, signed away his rights, couldn't handle a sick child. The prosecutor showed me the notebook my mother had kept, asked if I recognized it. I said yes, I'd found it when I was packing, and it documented every time she'd poisoned me for 15 years. She asked how that made me feel, and I said angry, betrayed, like my entire life had been a lie. The defense attorney cross-examined me and tried to suggest my mother had genuinely believed I was sick, that maybe I was confused about her intentions. I looked at her and said my mother was a nurse who kept detailed logs of which poisons she gave me and when, that she'd documented my reactions like a science experiment, that she'd admitted on a recorded phone call that she'd done it deliberately to keep me dependent, that there was no confusion. The jury looked at me with sympathy, and the defense attorney backed off. The trial lasted 2 weeks total. The defense tried to paint my mother as mentally ill and not responsible for her actions. They brought in their own psychologist who said she'd been operating under delusions and needed psychiatric treatment, but the prosecutor showed that my mother had been methodical and calculating. She'd researched substances and their effects. She'd carefully calibrated doses. She'd moved cities when she thought people were getting suspicious. She'd created fake identities and medical records. That wasn't delusion, that was planning. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they came back, the forewoman read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. Kidnapping, child abuse, medical fraud, assault with intent to cause bodily harm. My mother's face crumpled and she started crying. I felt nothing but relief. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. At sentencing, the judge heard impact statements. My father spoke about 15 years of not knowing if his son was alive or dead, about the cost of private investigators and the emotional toll on his life and his new marriage, about finally getting me back but realizing I'd been tortured for years and he couldn't undo that damage. I spoke too. I said my mother had stolen my childhood and my health and my ability to trust, that I still flinched when people offered me food because part of me expected it to be poisoned, that I had nightmares and panic attacks and couldn't believe my body was safe even when doctors assured me it was, that I was working on healing but some of that damage would never fully go away. The judge listened and then sentenced my mother to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole for 15 years. She said crimes against children, especially by those entrusted with their care, deserved the harshest punishment, that my mother had used her medical knowledge as a weapon against a helpless child, that she'd shown no remorse and blamed everyone but herself. My mother was led away in handcuffs, still crying. I watched her go and felt a chapter close. Outside the courthouse, my father hugged me and said it was finally over. We could move forward now. Moving forward was harder than I expected. I enrolled in public school for my senior year, and walking into that building with hundreds of normal kids was terrifying. Everyone seemed to know each other and moved through the halls with confidence I didn't have. Isabel had given me advice about navigating high school, but being there was different than hearing about it. I sat alone at lunch the first day until a girl named Zara asked if she could join me. She'd heard about my case from the news and wanted to tell me she thought I was brave. We started talking, and she introduced me to her friends, and suddenly I had a lunch table to sit at. Small victories. I tried out for the track team, even though I'd never run competitively. The coach said everyone started somewhere and put me on the junior varsity team. Running felt like freedom. like proving my body could do things I'd been told were impossible. My legs were strong and my lungs worked and nothing bad happened when I pushed myself. I started winning races and the team celebrated with me, and it felt normal in a way nothing had felt before. My father came to every meet and cheered louder than any other parent. Simone came too and took photos and made a scrapbook of my season. Normal family things. Dr. Vaughn and I worked on food anxiety. She had me try one new food each week in her office where I felt safe. Strawberries, shellfish, nuts, all the things I'd been told could kill me. Nothing happened. Every safe experience helped retrain my brain a little more. She explained that healing wasn't linear, that I'd have setbacks and bad days mixed with progress, that I should be patient with myself because 17 years of conditioning wouldn't disappear in a few months. I tried to remember that on days when I felt overwhelmed, on days when I couldn't eat because the fear was too strong, on days when I had panic attacks in class and had to leave. My teachers were understanding because the school had been briefed on my situation. They gave me extensions when I needed them and didn't make a big deal when I had to step out. I made friends slowly. Zara introduced me to her boyfriend Cole, who was into computers and gaming. He taught me to play and didn't ask about my past, just treated me like a normal person learning normal skills. Having friends who saw me as more than my trauma helped me see myself that way too. By spring, I'd been accepted to 3 colleges. I chose one in Colorado close to home because I wasn't ready to be far from my father yet. The summer before college, I got a job at a bookstore. My first real job ever. The manager knew my history and hired me anyway, said everyone deserved a chance at normal life. I worked the register and shelved books and recommended titles to customers. It was simple work, but it felt important. I was functioning in the world like any other 18-year-old. My coworker Lena became a friend, and we'd get coffee after shifts at the place next door. She ordered elaborate drinks, and I'd order the same thing because I still wasn't good at making my own choices. She noticed and started ordering different things each time, making me pick what I actually wanted. Small pushes toward independence. One day, I ordered something completely different from her, and she high-fived me like I'd accomplished something major. In a way, I had. Choosing for myself instead of defaulting to what others chose was still hard. Dr. Vaughn said that was normal for someone who'd had every decision made for them their entire childhood, that I was relearning autonomy, and it would take time. My father threw a graduation party in June and invited my whole track team and my friends from school. Isabel came home from college for it. Simone made a cake and everyone sang and it was loud and chaotic and normal. Everything I'd wanted without knowing I could want it. College started in August and moving into the dorms felt surreal. I had a roommate named Joel who was studying engineering and didn't know about my past. Just knew me as Owen, the guy who ran track and worked at a bookstore. We got along well, and he introduced me to his friends, and suddenly I had a whole social circle. I joined the cross-country team and made more friends there. Started going to parties and studying in the library and doing all the normal college things. I called my father every Sunday and told him about my week. He always asked if I was eating enough, sleeping enough, taking care of myself. Not from a place of control, but genuine care. The difference was obvious now. I declared a major in biology because I wanted to understand the body my mother had taught me to fear. Wanted to reclaim medical knowledge as something helpful instead of something weaponized against me. My professors were challenging and I struggled sometimes, but I was good at the science. Good at understanding how systems worked. Dr. Vaughn said that made sense, that I'd spent years being hyper-aware of my body, and that awareness translated well to studying biology. I hadn't thought of it that way, but she was right. The hypervigilance that had been survival mechanism was now serving me differently. 2 years into college, I got a call from Agent Pruitt. She said my mother was up for a parole hearing, even though she'd been sentenced without parole for 15 years. Apparently her attorney had found a technicality. They wanted to know if I'd be willing to speak at the hearing. My first instinct was to say no. I'd built a life, and didn't want her in it even peripherally. But Agent Pruitt said my voice mattered, that parole boards needed to hear from victims about ongoing impact. I talked to Dr. Vaughn, and she said it was my choice, but it might be empowering to face my mother as an adult who'd built a life despite her. I agreed to attend. The hearing was at the federal prison 3 hours away. My father offered to come, but I said I needed to do this alone. Simone packed me snacks for the drive, and Isabel texted me encouragement. The prison was gray and depressing and smelled like industrial cleaner. I went through security and was led to a hearing room where my mother sat at a table with her attorney. She looked older, thinner, gray hair she used to dye. She tried to smile when she saw me, but I didn't smile back. The parole board asked her questions about her rehabilitation and therapy. She talked about understanding her mental illness now, about medication and counseling, about regret for her actions. Then they asked if I wanted to speak. I stood and looked directly at my mother for the first time in 2 years. I said she'd stolen my childhood and convinced me my body was trying to kill me when she was the threat all along. That I'd spent 2 years in therapy learning to eat food and trust people and believe I was safe. That I still had nightmares and panic attacks and struggled with relationships because the person who should have protected me was the one hurting me. I said I'd built a good life despite her, not because of her. That I was in college and had friends and ran competitively and did everything she'd told me was impossible. that releasing her early would send a message that torturing a child for 15 years wasn't serious enough for full punishment, that she'd show no real remorse, only regret she got caught. The parole board thanked me, and I sat down. My mother's attorney tried to argue she was a different person now, but the board denied her parole, said she'd serve her full sentence. She stared at me with this look of betrayal as they led her away. I felt nothing but relief. Driving home, I called my father and told him it was over. She'd served 25 years and I'd be 42 when she got out. By then, I'd have a whole life she wasn't part of. I graduated college with honors and got accepted to graduate school for molecular biology. I was studying how environmental factors affected gene expression, which felt relevant, given how my mother had literally poisoned my environment for years. My research was published in a student journal, and my professors encouraged me to pursue a PhD. I started dating someone I met through the running club, a woman named Jasmine who studied literature and made me laugh and didn't treat me like I was fragile. I told her about my past on our third date because hiding it felt wrong. She listened and said that didn't change how she saw me. We'd been together a year when I proposed and she said yes. My father cried when I told him and said he'd thought he might never see me have normal milestones, that every good thing I experienced felt like victory over what my mother tried to take. The wedding was small, just family and close friends. Isabel was in the wedding party. Zara and Cole came, my track teammates. Dr. Vaughn attended as a guest and told me she was proud of how far I'd come. Jasmine's family welcomed me and never asked invasive questions about my childhood. They just treated me like their daughter's husband and future family. 5 years after the trial, I defended my dissertation and earned my PhD. I got a position at a research hospital studying pediatric medicine and working with children who had complex medical histories. Some were legitimate cases and some raised red flags that made me think of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. I consulted with social workers when I had concerns and helped identify 3 cases where parents were making children sick. Those interventions led to children being removed and getting help. Using my experience to protect others felt like the best possible outcome of what I'd survived. Agent Pruitt stayed in touch over the years and told me my case had indeed changed how prosecutors approached medical abuse cases, that my mother's documentation had set legal precedent and made it easier to charge and convict other caregivers who harmed children under the guise of medical care. She said I should be proud that my survival and testimony had protected other kids. I told her I was just glad something good came from it. Jasmine and I had our first child 3 years after we got married, a daughter we named Simone after my stepmother. Holding her in the hospital, I felt this overwhelming protective instinct and understood for the first time how twisted my mother's version of protection had been. Real love didn't trap or hurt or control. Real love wanted the person to thrive and grow and be free. My father visited often and played with his granddaughter and never mentioned my mother unless I brought her up, which I rarely did. She was a chapter I'd closed. Dr. Vaughn retired, but we still had coffee every few months, and she watched me build the life I'd been told was impossible. On my 30th birthday, Jasmine threw a party, and I looked around at the friends and family and the career I loved and the daughter I was raising in safety and freedom. I thought about 17-year-old me climbing out a window to call for help, terrified and conditioned to fear everything. That kid had been brave enough to escape and start over. Now I was living the life he'd fought for, and that was the best revenge possible against someone who'd tried to keep me dependent and sick forever. I was healthy and free and surrounded by people who loved me without conditions. My mother had lost everything trying to control me, and I'd won by finally learning to trust myself. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.